Welcome to the Journal podcast from the Chartered Insurance Institute, a place for thought-provoking discussion from the world of insurance. I'm Vanessa Riboloni, Head of Research and Insight at the CII. Today's podcast follows the launch of the CII's Managing Customer Vulnerability Practical Implementation Guide, a comprehensive resource that helps firms translate regulatory principles into practice. The guide brings under one master document existing best practice with links to relevant resources that cover training, customer communications and support, or inclusive design. But it really focuses on filling the gap where implementation breaks down, which is data infrastructure and reporting frameworks. Today's podcast tackles the myths that hold firms back from effective vulnerability implementation. I'm joined by my co-author, Martin Grimwood, and Mandy Hunt, who has also been instrumental in the development and co-creation of this guide. Martin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Vanessa. I'm Martin Grimwood. I'm from FWD Consulting. I have a background in customer protection research, and I have been helping the FCA over the last 10 years with some of their policy changes through insights. Today, I advise firms on how to implement consumer duty and vulnerability guidance.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Mandy, do you want to say a few words about yourself?
Thanks, Vanessa. Firstly, I think this piece of work is excellent and I'm really glad to see it. And that comes from the place that my husband is a vulnerable person. So we experience the challenges that people face having some vulnerabilities in financial services and day-to-day life. So it's really positive to see this. And so aside from my husband being vulnerable, I am the managing director of Shape Underwriting, an MGA, but previously worked for Intact, or RSA as a chief underwriting officer. So customers and getting things right and processes are really important as part of that role.
Thank you so much. And just to say that as part of the co-creation of the guidance, we've engaged with vulnerability experts and customer experience practitioners and sector leaders, but also contributions and feedback from people with lived experience, which is really important. So let's kick off by setting the context and starting with the fundamentals. Consumer duty has been enforced for 2 years now, and vulnerability guidance since 2021. So, Martin, what has changed in how firms are expected to approach vulnerability?
Well, I think the first thing to say is nothing's changed, and that the FCA have been very consistent in the message that they have put out to the markets. So what we've decided to do at the CII when we wrote the guide is to attempt to bring all of that guidance into one place since GF21 was published. And really, it's all about data. So in your introduction, Vanessa, you mentioned data and data systems. So that's what we're going to focus on today. And that's really what the FCA are looking for as well. You may have heard in speeches the FCA talking about it's all about data. So firms need robust systems in place to develop customer vulnerability strategies and to ultimately deliver good outcomes to their vulnerable customers. And I suppose, if you look at the structure of the guide that's been published, it follows the guidance of the FCA in those major steps. So the FCA have been very consistent in saying you first need to understand the scale and characteristics of vulnerability. Once you have that knowledge, you're able to then determine whether the vulnerabilities that those customers have in the context of how they interact with your firm may lead to harm. Where you understand that harm is possible, you then need to develop initiatives and solutions to prevent that harm taking place. Once you have those solutions in place, as you systematically identify vulnerable customers, when you come across them and record them in your day-to-day activities, you can then direct them to the right propositions and the right support that they need so that they experience good customer outcomes. And crucially, you need to monitor whether those outcomes have been delivered or not. So one of the big requirements of consumer duty is for vulnerable customers to experience similar outcomes to other customers. It's a virtual loop. If you discover that they aren't receiving similar outcomes, you go back to the drawing board and you start to look at the solutions that you put in place.
Thank you, Martin. So the bottom line is data, data, data. And you said, the FCA talks about this in speeches, but they've also done a couple of reviews, haven't they? The board reporting review that they did at the back end of last year and the vulnerability review that was launched in March of 2025, where They identified good progress in some areas, but also some areas that still need development. For example, recognition that firms need better MI and better data quality to be able to monitor over time and do that cohort and segmentation analysis, including using that data to inform product and service design. And also another area that they identified as requiring improvement, which is not directly related to data, but it's around training gaps and recognizing that a lot of firms are focusing on frontline staff, but training has to be organizational wide. So Mandy, from an operational perspective, what does it mean on the ground? What does this mean on the ground?
So recording of data is obviously going to be the critical part of this. And that's going to be quite a big shift from people leaving small notes on customer files, whether that's electronic or paper, to having formal systems that they can record data in. And so that's going to be a mix of improving processes, making sure call scripts and I guess SLAs allow people the time to do the recording in the right way, making sure people have the training that means that they can do it and record it correctly. And more importantly, shifting from a tick box kind of process to much more of a cultural shift in recognizing the importance of recording the data. So we need to do a mixture of the what and the how, and so that people really can move forward. But most importantly, vulnerable customers can have confidence then in the outcomes they're receiving because people can monitor it in the right way.
Agree. And the point of culture is so important, isn't it? As when at the launch, we were asked, like, how do we ensure that data doesn't in itself become a tick box exercise? And it's that data plus the culture that need to go hand in hand. So also part of setting the context, Mandy, you mentioned that you've got lived experience of vulnerability and Martin, you too. So from your own lived experience, what does good practice actually look like from the customer's perspective?
I think inherently, right, people are good and they want to listen and they want to be empathetic. But in our jobs, we are always set rules and controls, aren't we? Whatever we do, whether that's the number of baked beans you put on a shelf in a supermarket to how quickly you repair a car or you deal with financial services. So I think that the bit that we need to recognize is that when you have a vulnerability, you want to be listened to. You want to have somebody that's empathetic, and you want to have somebody that you know is as kind of joining those two things up in an outcome that works for you. And I don't think we do that very often. We do it sometimes brilliantly, and other times it can be a real challenge. I've talked before about phoning up about I didn't do it actually, but my husband had to phone about my father-in-law's insurance policy. And at the end of the call, they said, we need to speak to the policyholder. The reason he was phoning is because my father-in-law had passed away. So it was impossible. And that's because they were not listening in the right way. And I'm not being critical of the individual. I'm sure there were loads of reasons for it. But so for me, people need to adjust practices so that there is time to listen. There's time to understand. There's time to use your human instincts of kindness and empathy and then pull it all together in the way that we handle vulnerable customers.
Yeah, I mean, colleagues in firms, they want to do their best, but they deserve to be supported with the right systems, processes, training, and empowered to be able to go off script if they need to go off script, for example.
Totally. Yep, absolutely.
So yeah, how about you, Martin?
Well, I think bring it back to the conversation we're having around data. I mean, data is a small word, but it covers a lot of. It's a large church in terms of what it covers, and I'll give you an example of that. My father died last year, and I was responsible for contacting all of the financial services firms that he had relationships with, and in the majority of cases, the bereavements teams were both empathetic. As Mandy said, that's a really important component, but I think also they were also effective. And when they weren't effective, it really came down to the fact that data wasn't being passed around the business. So I'll give you a very good example of that. I'll give you two examples, actually. In terms of a bad experience, Tesco Bank, okay? And I will name them because I think part of this conversation around meeting customer outcomes is the commercial impact on those who get it right and really the negative impact on those firms that get it wrong. And my father had a credit card with Tesco Bank, and I didn't know this until the time, but there are no joint credit cards in the UK. You have a primary card holder, and then the spouse, in this case, has a second card. And when that person dies, effectively, the credit card ceases. Now, This was fairly straightforward. We contacted Tesco Bank and the bereavement team. They said, that's not a problem. I'm going to cancel this. All you need to do is get in touch with the acquiring team and they will issue your mother with a new card. So we did what they said. We went to the acquiring team and that data wasn't passed through. There was no vulnerability flag passed through to the acquiring team. And so my mother was refused a card because she was 88, had no credit history, because she'd paid a mortgage off 30 years prior. She'd be using the credit card that my father had, and she had no loans. So that's an example of how things break down. I'll give you a good example from the insurance sector, and I'll name them again. NFU Mutual, fabulous experience. And it was fabulous because the local office had the empathy, but also the empowerment to act. They flagged on the system to the underwriters what had happened. And within 2 days, Mum had a new policy, actually with a cheaper premium, and she was able to continue driving. And that's because from that point of contact, talking about the vulnerability, it was flagged in the system so that colleagues knew that there was an action to do and there was a policy in place. So that's good and bad. I'm a massive advocate now of NFU Mutual, and going back to my earlier point, that when firms get it right, then they get loyalty and they get advocacy.
You are definitely promoting them. I've heard you talk about this story in more than one occasion, but data sharing is so important, not only internally. If we think of insurance, it's such a complex value chain, distribution chain, that data sharing is also fundamental, so that brokers pass on any vulnerability information to the insurer, and insurers can also do the same thing when they are dealing with third-party claims support. So data sharing is another big one, and it's an area that the CRI is going to be focusing on next year to help find solutions to overcome the technical and cultural barriers that prevent firms to share data. So we've set a bit of the context, and now we're going to move on to the core of the podcast today, which is about the myths. So the CII guidance addresses several myths that seem to hold firms back, and we're going to tackle these head on. Starting with one that is less of a myth, but more of a misplaced understanding of vulnerability, which is that we still hear people and firms equate certain characteristics of vulnerability as being inherently indicators of vulnerability. So, for example, older age equating with being vulnerable, or assuming that if a customer is wealthy, they can't be vulnerable. So, Martin, what do you have to say about this? How do you respond?
Well, there's quite a few things there. I suppose I would go back to the way in which the FCA defined vulnerability. There are a lot of vulnerability frameworks in existence. The FCA have decided that there are 4 types of vulnerability, and it's all about resilience against those vulnerabilities. So you've got a negative life event, you've got financial resilience, you've got health, and you've got financial capability. And I suppose one of the things that we do come across as consultants is that firms identify, in insurance, for example, if you make a claim, it's a negative life event. But the reality is your vulnerability strategy shouldn't just be based on claims, because that person may make a claim. Yes, that's a negative life event, but they may also have low financial capabilities. They also may have very low, may be going through some mental health problems. So you've got 3 vulnerabilities coming together and clashing. So another example here is when we talk to banks sometimes, banks say, we're lenders. We should focus on financial resilience. I understand that, but again, it's the context of that person's vulnerabilities that come together in this kind of catalyst that the banks need to consider. So if we go back to the vulnerability guidance, the definition here is someone who, due to their personal circumstances, is especially susceptible to harm, particularly when a firm is not acting with appropriate levels of care. So really, to get this right, firms have to first understand what the vulnerabilities look like, and then put those vulnerabilities into context in terms of how they interact with the firm. Example, physical disabilities, they're permanent for most individuals. If you've got a mobility problem and you have a relationship with a firm that has interactions in a branch, for example, you need to take that into account, because it's fairly straightforward that if you don't allow access to that branch, then you are potentially bringing harm into that relationship. So I think it's about really understanding what the vulnerabilities are, and then to sit down and put them into the context of how you as a firm interact and the services that you provide.
It's such a complex matter, isn't it? Also, they're taking into account that there are severity levels of vulnerability. You've touched on the fact that vulnerability is contextual. So it's really hard to get your head around when firms are trying to approach this matter with manual processes or spreadsheets, and that's where the data and the systems and the processes come into place. Another myth that holds firms back, and we hear constantly, is that we can't hold sensitive data because of UK GDPR. What is the reality?
Well, it's incorrect. GDPR is there to protect data. Okay. So this is all about collecting sensitive data on customers. And under GDPR rules, that is absolutely fine. It's what you do with it, though. So to be compliant with GDPR, you've got to record the method of processing. You've got to store the information accurately and securely. You've got to provide any information held to customers on request. And you need to delete individual customers' information when requested. Fairly simple rules. I think the problem here lies is not GDPR. It's a firm's ability to comply with GDPR. And, we've mentioned already in this podcast that systems are really important. And what we're finding is that firms just don't have robust systems to handle that kind of data. And as Mandy mentioned earlier, sometimes recording vulnerability is on a case file, which is paper-based rather than systems. And that's where problems start to crop up. And that's why, quite rightly, firms are very shy of GDPR and falling foul of them. Really, vulnerability, consumer duty is not going away. The FCA have been very clear about that. And if I'm being very brutal, firms need to invest in the architecture, the systems architecture, so that they can start to collect all of this information in a compliant way and will ultimately benefit the business. And I'm sure we're going to come on to that question later on.
So compounding to the complexity of managing vulnerability, there is the complexity of GDPR. And I believe the FCA is going to publish a joint statement with the ICO early in the year. And the CRI is also working on separate guidance on this specific topic. So it's really about doing it properly rather than avoiding it entirely, and having the right systems and processes to support data management compliantly. And from the customer point of view, what does doing it properly mean? How can firms create safe environments to encourage disclosure, not only at point of claim or sale, but across the whole customer journey? Mandy?
So I think that probably comes or breaks down into three areas. So you need to develop empathetic and open questions, I would say. So yes, no questions are never going to get somebody comfortable. So you need to be able to ask questions in a way that gets more out of somebody. And when people feel listened to, as I said earlier, they're also more likely to share more personal information. So that will help people record things, because we have to come from a place that there's no expectation people will share it. And frankly, when you're sharing personal information, maybe about some of the things Martin said, to an insurance company in particular, you may think it's going to harm your premium or your cover in some way. So there's already a barrier, and it's up to us to create frameworks that enable us to get under the skin of that and give people confidence. We absolutely need to empower staff so that they have got systems and protocols, and Martin's talked eloquently about that. But the importance of those things, it's really important for outcomes. It's really important to meet regulatory requirements, but it's also really important for the people that are dealing with vulnerable customers and any customers to be able to get that recorded in the right way and enable them to do their jobs in the best way they can by giving them time. Because SLAs often go, you've got to get through this first part of the call in 30 seconds. And sometimes that's not possible. We only heard last week about the difficulty people with stammers have on some of these conversations, which actually, despite my husband being vulnerable, still shocked me when I heard those stories. And that's because that's not my lived experience currently. But for people in that space, it's hard. So we need to allow time. And I guess, the other part of that is making sure that there's training. And I don't mean tick box training. I mean training that is ongoing, repeated, and enables people to really develop. And then the final thing, and this one I find really important, is to offer a range of accessible methods. So my husband at 9 o'clock in the morning would be probably okay talking to somebody on a phone. By 5 o'clock in the evening, he would not be so okay talking on the phone. So he wants to be able to contact people safely and securely through different channels that, to deal with his issues. So being able to create different accessible disclosure channels is going to be really important.
Certainly, when it comes to questioning, going beyond a blunt question such as, are you vulnerable? And also, I'm just thinking about maybe a question that comes up sometimes, which is some customers might not be aware that they are vulnerable. How can firms go about trying to understand and ascertain those circumstances in which the customer themselves might not be aware of their own vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really difficult one. But so I had to ring the NHS pharmacy. I don't know, whatever the prepayment line is, a couple of months ago, and as part of their script, when you get put through, it says, in the event that you abuse our staff, you may be subject to criminal prosecutions. And it was very negative feeling, to be honest, when I had no intention of being horrible to anybody. But there is a start point. If we're going to have calls like that, we could have scripts that talk about vulnerability really early on, couldn't we? We could start to allow people to say, in the event that you have a vulnerability that you feel it would benefit us to know, you can put it in general script areas so that people can talk about it. I think it's going to be hard. We need to train people to be able to understand how to get those questions. I'll be honest, my husband would just quite often prefer a simple question. Is there anything additional we can do to help you to make these interactions easier? Sometimes with energy companies, that can be really easy. If you ring your supplier, they want to know because they'll sort you out quickly. If you end up with no electricity, no heating, I don't think we kind of have the same connotations with the financial services sector, and I think we need also to talk to the people that are on the phone to customers, because they know what they're hearing and experiencing. So me sitting on the sideline when I'm not having those phone calls, trying to tell people what to say, is not as good as somebody that's on the phone talking to people. And getting their answers. The same as you've talked to people with lived experience of vulnerability for this guidance. That's what also we need to do in training. But yeah, it's hard.
Yeah, I think there are some solutions out there around vulnerability management that use objective assessments that are like, it's kind of a set of questions that have been developed on the back of the hundreds of different permutations of vulnerability that exist that overcome that subjectivity element that frontline staff might have. But yeah, complex matter. So moving on, another thing that we hear is the quote, "We already understand our customer base." But some of these firms that believe that they understand their customer base may only detect single-digit percentages of customers in vulnerable circumstances. And we do know from the FCA's Financial Lives survey that up to 50% of UK adults display characteristics of vulnerability at any given time. And given the fluctuating and nature and fluid nature of vulnerability, all of us can become vulnerable at some point. So Martin, how do you respond to this? And why do you think that vulnerability can go undetected?
Okay, that's a big question. So hopefully I'll settle in for this answer. Yeah, okay. So let's tackle the issue of why it's important to get it right. And I think then I'll explain how to do it. So yeah, 5% is unrealistic. Even the most niche providers where you've got high net worth individuals and they've got some very strong resilience to economic shock, and they've possibly got very strong financial literacy skills. Even then, it's going to be more than 5% because it's they still have health issues, they still have negative life events and those curveballs. So 5% is unrealistic, and I think firms know that they're unrealistic. Why is it important to get it right? Well, as I always quote Graham Reynolds from the SCA, he had a fabulous speech to PIMFA back in October last year, where he said, well, if you don't understand the scale and characteristics of vulnerability, how on earth are you going to build a strategy? You wouldn't launch your product unless you knew all the characteristics of your target market and their needs. So why would you launch a vulnerable customer strategy unless you'd done that homework? And really 4% comes from the fact that firms are just looking at the customers that have disclosed that to them. They haven't actually gone out and proactively asked of a representative sample or of a census of their customers whether they have those characteristics and what they want those characteristics recorded. Now, I appreciate it's a big ask for small firms, and proportionality is a really important thing. So those firms who are small and they want to get a feel for what their sector looks like in terms of vulnerability, I think we've mentioned this before in one of our webinars, go to the Financial Lives data. the FCA just quote the national average, which is 50%. If you want to look at different categories, like in customers with investments, customers with insurance policies, the data's there. So that's a good starting point. If you're a much larger firm, though, and obviously some general insurers have got tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of customers, that's not realistic because your view of vulnerability will be very different. It differs by sector, but it also differs by target market. So, for example, if you're an investment advisor advising on mass market customers versus a high net worth target market, you're going to have very, very different customer profiles in terms of vulnerability. So how do you go about understanding vulnerability and characteristics of vulnerability? There are two approaches. I call them bottom up and top down. So bottom up is where you proactively contact customers to determine at an individual level whether they have any characteristics of vulnerability. And so 3% over time becomes 10%, becomes 15%, becomes 20%, until you get to that point where you've talked to enough customers to get a reliable understanding of what vulnerability is. In some cases, that will take years to achieve. So it's something that is aspirational, and it's something that should be happening. The top-down approach is something that we do at FWD, and that's really replicating what the FCA do themselves through Financial Lives. We advocate for large firms to run surveys with their customers on a representative sample to understand the characteristics of vulnerability. And what you get if you do what the FCA do, you can understand what proportion of your customers have permanent characteristics, so you can plan for that. But importantly, because it's a survey, you can understand the probability of some of those temporary vulnerabilities impacting your customers, and you can plan for them. So that if you know in any given year that 5% of your customers will go through a divorce or a relationship breakdown, you have to ask yourself, okay, in the context of our business, is that a problem? And if it is a problem, we need to mitigate the risk there. So we know it's 5%. We've got enough bums on seats in the call center handling that specific vulnerability, and we've got a solution in place. So there are two ways to understand vulnerability. There's the bottom-up approach, which should be happening, and also that top-down approach, which I would advocate to firms, large firms especially, where they're not going to get to that bottom-up figure very soon.
Mm-mm. So in the guide, we talk about reactive and proactive, which is the same, and a hybrid model of both proactive and reactive identification methods typically delivers the best outcomes, doesn't it? And especially we're trying to promote firms moving from that reactive only to be able to be more anticipatory and have the right data to be able to put vulnerability strategies in place based on the makeup of the target market and the customer base of firms. So moving on to another major myth, Mandy, treating vulnerable customers will unacceptably add costs. What's your response to that?
So I don't agree is probably where I'm at. And I think that fear of cost is generally pretty unjustified. I was thinking about my local vicinity, my local street. I think at a very high level, if I just went round, probably 50% of customers, if we were all insured with the same people, might have some vulnerabilities for some of the reasons we've talked about earlier. Some of those would be very mild and would need only the recording of that information, and some would be much more complex and would need some additional steps. And often people have already got those steps in place. You know, if you take my husband, for instance, the things that he struggles with, I take over and do, and other people will be in similar situations. And it's going to be important for people to kind of adapt their processes to recognise those things. So a really quick thing that often actually only happened this week with an insurer for our motor insurance was, can I just check with your husband, you've got permission to deal with the policy on his behalf. It's recorded once and it's done. And now I can look after his policy. And obviously that makes his life far more simple and easy for me when I phone up in the future. So being able to adapt your processes and kind of manage those things is important. So working with the situation, not against it, And I think the other part of that is great experiences tends to drive loyalty. At a very simple level, if you go to a restaurant and the food is great and your experience is good, you tend to go back. And I think the same logic applies to financial services. If your experience through the renewal, through the, adding a new car, adding a cover, or making a claim is a positive one, you're more likely to be loyal to that provider. That loyalty will give a good financial outcome. And I think the other part is, we all know how hard it is to fix a problem after the event. It's hard, and often it costs more money than if you'd done it right in the first place. How many builders have you had in and you just put your hand in your heads and think, if we'd only done it right in the first place, it would have been easier, quicker and cheaper than it is today. And that's the same with the processes we need to put in place in financial services. We need to do it early, and we need to avoid responding when there are complaints. But clearly, when our data tells us something about our processes, we also need to go back and change them.
And in order to be able to do it early, there needs to be an upfront investment in systems. So, Martin, what do you think about the investment that is required? Is that something that is worth doing?
Well, I was thinking about this morning on the train in, actually. It's a little bit like political parties where they know something is fundamentally broken with the system, but they don't actually try and fix it because they can't do it in this parliament. It's the same with the systems. We know now that most firms don't have the systems in place to be able to do this correctly. So there has to be some kind of investment. And I'm sympathetic to that, because if you look at most financial services firms, they've got so many legacy brands in there, different systems. It's quite chaotic, and I think it's one of those things that firms before Consumer Duty and before vulnerability guidance knew they'd have to change something. So the way I look at it, it's a strategic investment. If the board is looking at this now, make a strategic investment. It's not for the short term; it's for the longer term. And I think there are advantages of doing this. It's not just compliance to the FCA. As you heard earlier, I'm a huge detractor in NPS terms for one brand, but a positive promoter for another brand. And those positive experiences do breed loyalty. They reduce complaints. There's a positive uplift for the firm to get it right. And the FCA have been talking about this as well. It's not just a stick message from the FCA. There's a carrot there as well. That they talk about the positive return on investment for firms who get it right in terms of customer centricity. I think there are other things to consider here as well. The cost of serving 50% of your customers wrongly is quite significant. There's a lot of toing and froing that shouldn't happen if only there was data there to guide customers into the right service and the right solution. And I think the final thing in terms of, if I was talking to a CEO of a financial services firm, think about your staff as well. It must be incredibly hard for a frontline colleague to deal with some of the challenging requirements and circumstances of vulnerable customers if they don't have a solution in place. And what you tend to find is that frontline staff do understand, do have the empathy, and have to create their own hacks to provide services to customers. If you had the right systems in place, if you had the right information in place and the solutions in place, that wouldn't be happen. And there's an element to this that's really important as well, that, frontline staff, there is this element of staff burnout that boards need to be cognitive of. So it's not just about customer, it's about the health of your business, it's about business growth, it's about colleagues.
So in summary, it's a short-term investment for longer-term gains, and ultimately it kind of makes business sense. You mentioned NPS. Another myth or misunderstanding is NPS is obviously a metric that is used in the context of customer experience, and there is a myth that equates or thinks of good customer experience equals good outcomes. What do you have to say about that, Martin?
Hey, NPS is just a question. It is something that for a couple of decades now has been a one number that boards like to look at. And it's like anything. If you do a survey and you track it over time, you can see how sentiment to your brand changes. One of the major things that, customer experience research, it's about whether your brand is being delivered. So is your brand message resulting in a good brand experience? The way in which if you're looking at surveys for customers, yes, there is a different way of asking questions now. You don't ask how satisfied they are. You have to look at Consumer Duty and interpret what the FCA is asking for and put it into a question. So if you look at customer understanding, for example, the FCA is not asking customers whether they understand things. They're actually asking whether they can make an informed decision on the information that's been provided to them. So that's an outcome. So yeah, if you are using customer surveys, rethink how you are asking those questions so that you're actually looking at outcomes.
Thank you. So customer outcomes differ from customer experience insights, although they may overlap at some times, basically.
Absolutely.
So moving on to training, Mandy, because we often hear we just need to train frontline staff and we are done. Why isn't training of frontline staff sufficient in its own?
Gosh, if only it was as simple as frontline staff, I'm sure everyone would be much happier because of the cost of perhaps training. But training is only one part of the situation. When you start to think about a product, from the design to the underwriting to the pricing to the customer journey to the claims journey to a customer leaving, there are various people that touch that journey all the way through. And they need to be thinking about product design around vulnerabilities. And therefore, they need to understand it. Therefore, they need to be part of the training that actually exists. And importantly, I think for me, if you're going to work in a sector where vulnerable customers are a feature, and they very heavily are in financial services and insurance, then the organisation at its heart needs to have training that means that people understand those complexities and what their brand, I guess, as we've just talked about, is delivering for those customers. So yeah, training is just one part. Support systems to be able to record data. We've talked about the importance of having systems that do that is another area. We need training not to be tick box. I talked about that earlier. It has to be ongoing. It has to be kind of embedded. I don't want to see 1 hour training online. I want people to be in a room and experiencing it and talking about their own lived experiences, because all the things we've talked about today, we will not be the only two people that have experienced those things. There will be many people across the world that have come across those things. So help people get there. And I guess companies need to think about making roles manageable. Martin talked earlier about the complexity of dealing with maybe somebody's phoning up to make a claim. That's difficult enough. Somebody's got vulnerabilities. They're trying to log them. They're trying to find the right process to follow. That's hard. And it needs people to manage kind of roles and processes to be efficient. So yeah, training for me is critical for everyone. It's definitely not for frontline staff. It doesn't matter where you are in the customer journey. You should understand it. And then it comes back to design principles about, how you build a product and how you capture the data that's important.
And the guidance covers at a very high level scope of training content, but it also gives some pointers around how to go about measuring the effectiveness of training to prove that it is actually delivering good outcomes. And it talks about leading indicators, lagging indicators. So if anyone's interested, they can go to page 36 of the guidance. So I'm going to move on to a cluster of myths that have to do or are related to customer engagement, fears and reactions, and hearing things such as, we don't need to assess everyone or be proactive, let customers come to us, or asking personal questions will reduce sales, or customers won't like it. So what does the evidence actually show, Martin?
Well, the evidence contradicts those fears. I think that those fears are based on assumptions that are not founded. It's all about context, and we've talked about that in earlier in this podcast. If you explain to customers why you're doing something, and it's in their best interests, we're looking to understand your needs better so that we can provide you with a better service or a differentiated service, then that absolutely works. It doesn't work if you say it's a regulatory box. It doesn't work to say that we're checking on your vulnerabilities. You don't ask it in that way. And I think you're going to ask a question probably later about that. If you look at the top-down, bottom-up approaches that I mentioned earlier, I know in the bottom-up approaches, because I work with consultants who do that, they get hit rates of about 95% returns. Okay, so they're sending out short surveys to customers to ask about some of their circumstances. The way in which they are positioned is sensitive, and an explanation is provided why that information is important to get the best product, the best service for that customer. And they get 95% returns. the top-down approach that I personally get involved in, where we send surveys out to customers to understand an overall level what vulnerability looks like, I'm amazed in terms of the response rates. We recently did this work for an annuity provider where we had a significant proportion of over 75-year-olds completing online forms. And that blew all the expectations, So there isn't a fear of providing this information if the context is provided to the customer and the customer feels they're in a trusted space that they can actually provide that information. And that goes back to what we were saying about systems and GDPR rules, holding data in a safe way so that customers can trust the process.
And explaining the value exchange. I give you my data, but why? Well, because you'll be better supported if you end up being in a circumstance where you become vulnerable.
That's a lovely way of articulating that, yeah. The value exchange.
So there is a related concern as well, an assumption people won't like being labeled as vulnerable. How should firms navigate language and framing, Martin?
I think vulnerability is an internal label. It's not something that I would ever mention in any survey that I was sending out to a customer. It's about understanding their needs. So yeah, it's an easy one to answer. You don't talk about vulnerability in that way to customers. It has to be about understanding their needs so that we can better support you.
Mandy, do you have anything to say about language and framing?
No, so I've definitely been in a couple of calls over the years where I've asked people why they want a piece of information and they can't tell me. So coming back to being able to explain why you're requesting information, making sure people can explain that, and then knowing that it's going to be of benefit to you is going to be a really important thing. At that point that Martin made about being trusted to receive that information is important. But I can really only on this speak about how Neil would feel when people give him the time to be able to explain what his challenges are. The outcomes are always better for him. So if I just remove that from the FCA requirements on customer outcomes for the company, he feels better at the end of that experience. And as someone watching that, that's a much better place to be. And of course, that drives more and more loyalty as you go forward when you can be trusting in that experience and be there. So I think a lot of people will be quite happy to share the challenges they have. They just don't want it to be used against them.
Gosh, we've covered a lot, and we're coming to close now. So before closing, any final practical advice for firms listening who feel overwhelmed by where to start? Martin?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's actually something I was discussing with the FCA at the CII launch last Tuesday. John Person was there with a couple of his colleagues. And really, it's about getting the basics right. What we were talking about there, and I won't quote the FCA individual, but they're saying that they're seeing firms doing quite a lot of disparate activities around vulnerability. And in some cases, they're not needed. So, if you don't understand what vulnerability looks like and you assume that you need some service over here for vulnerable customers that actually in reality isn't required, that's a waste of resource. So the message from the FCA has always been, I go back to Graham Reynolds, go through that stage by stage process, understand vulnerability and the characteristics of vulnerability, then determine whether those vulnerabilities have an impact on how you deliver that service and whether there's potential harm, and then start to create those solutions, get that training in, start to identify those customers, signpost them to those services, or provide propositions to them that meet those needs. It's really about going back to basics. So, it's not about getting it right first time either. It's about incremental changes, but you have to get those foundations right first.
Don't aim for perfection from the outset. Pilot, start small, iterate, and move on from there. How about you, Mandy? What would you have to say for firms that might feel a bit overwhelmed on the complexities of it all and where to start?
I think getting ahead of this stuff is going to always be important, as often is the case. I think sometimes we wait for others to kind of show their hands in, and I think when it comes to this particular topic, we need to go more quickly. There's facts, aren't there? Something like, if you have a really good experience, you tell one person. If you have a really bad experience, you tell 8 or something. Bad news travels really fast. That's how quickly your brand can change by not doing things properly. So I think the view from me would be, let's get ahead of these things. Let's have conversations about it. Let's look at systems and to the point, make incremental changes as you can. And that will stand you in good stead, because then it's at the heart of your business, which is important.
Yeah, and always think in terms of proportionality as well. There's so many different sizes of firms and types of firm, and everyone is in its own unique journey of customer vulnerability management strategy. So there are some really helpful checklists in the guidance that will help assess your level of maturity. So we've covered considerable ground, from dispelling myths around GDPR and data handling, costs and customer engagement, all myths that really just don't hold up when you actually implement these practices properly. So what we've heard from Martin and Mandy is that it's about getting the basics right, building the infrastructure that helps your teams actually help customers, and showing you're making progress to the FCA. The CII guidance is here to help you navigate this. The good practice guidance is available now, and you will find useful links in the show notes below. Thank you, Mandy and Martin, for your insights today. Please like, review, and subscribe. Until next time, goodbye.